How the Hollywood representation of the male hero in cinema has changed post 9/11. The way in which Hollywood cinema represented male heroes has changed over time. One of the biggest and most impactful beacons for this representation change was the 9/11 attacks in the Iraq War. Pre 9/11, masculinity was viewed purely as a spectacle. Heroes had to be physically strong and not show vulnerability or weakness, especially not emotionally. We can take a look at Hollywood films pre 9/11, such as Terminator, 1984 by James Cameron, where our hero is a buff white man. Terminator is a good example of a hero shown before the Iraq War affected cinema, as Arnold Schwarzenegger had become the ideal. Even cinematography in these films had a hand in presenting the ideal man. Low camera angles were used a lot, including in Terminator, to emphasize the sense of power the male hero had. These narcissistic fantasies filmmakers and viewers had of the male hero are discussed in the book Screening the Male, Exploring Masculinities in Hollywood Cinema by Stephen Cohen and Ina Ray Haag, where they describe the male hero as powerful and omnipotent to an extraordinary degree. They continue on to give examples of films where this is the case, such as Superman, 1978, Flash Gordon, 1980, and The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, 1967. All of these examples are films that were made pre 9/11 and are excellent testimonies of the proof of the representation of the past. According to Martin Baker in A Toxic Genre, post 9/11 Iraq films on the topic of the war were being awaited by the public because of Hollywood's previous cowardice over creating war films based on Vietnam. Between 2005 and 2008, at least 23 fiction films were released, claiming to be reflections of the war. This included The Hurt Locker, made in 2008, directed by Kathryn Bigelow. This film in particular is an ideal example of how 9/11 changed representation in contemporary Hollywood cinema, as it was popular among general audiences and critics, since it won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 2010 and made $49.2 million at the box office. The Hurt Locker tackled the conflict within Iraq and gave a more authentic representation of the Hollywood male hero. As well as this, the writer of The Hurt Locker is Mark Boal, who spent time as an embedded journalist in the American Armed Forces. Boal's experience with men in the field helped to create a more realistic representation of the men in the film due to it being drawing examples from real life. In the book mentioned previously, McCriskin and Pepper are brought up to discuss how we should consider what kinds of questions films raise about the meaning and significance of events. One of which is, what messages and conclusions are they sending to the audience? The Hurt Locker, through its knowledge on the realism of events, sends a message to the audience about emotional vulnerability in men, especially those from war. The film touches on PTSD, which is something Hollywood films pre 9/11 scarcely mentioned, whereas in The Hurt Locker, we see characters receiving an almost therapy-like checkup from the doctor. The film also uses cinematography to aid their character development. They show their heroes from higher up camera angles, which, contrary to pre 9/11 films, demonstrates a more vulnerable individual. The main character of Bigelow's film, William James, is a prime example of representation of a heroic men in contemporary Hollywood cinema, as she shows him as a victim of war over an unaffected tyrant. The final message of the film is that he is unable to blend back into society after the war, seen by a scene of him shopping and how uncomfortable the bright, clean, organised aisles are for him, and how he has to return to war because it's where he feels he belongs. Creating a circular narrative that doesn't create the typical satisfying ending of pre 9/11 war films, where the hero appears unaffected and can return back to normality easily. This film is one of many contemporary Hollywood films that represent male heroes in a more realistic, more human way. In conclusion, 9/11 and the Iraq War completely altered the way in which filmmakers wanted to present their heroes, to match with the views of civilians and war heroes. 9/11 was a major turning point in the world of cinema, which turned the typical Hollywood hero from the buff, tough white man, that of the Terminator, into a more contemporary, more human, emotionally vulnerable individual of that of William James. The 9/11 attacks and the Iraq War forever changed Hollywood's heroes.